Imagine ancient Rome, but not the Rome of shining statues, marching legions, or the famous emperors the history books love to highlight. Today, I want to take you somewhere else, somewhere decisions were truly made, into quiet corridors, whispered conversations, and agreements that shaped the fate of millions, yet never appeared in any official record. Because in the end, the real question is, was the Senate ruling Rome? Or was it being ruled by forces no one ever saw? And that's exactly what makes this story so fascinating. The Roman Senate is often portrayed as a symbol of wisdom, order, and tradition. Those men in long white togas, gathered in a circle debating the future of the Republic. It almost sounds noble, doesn't it? But behind that idealized image, something entirely different existed. Few people realize that behind the scenes, influential senators traded favors, built secret alliances, and even manipulated decisions for their own benefit. And the most curious part, this wasn't an exception. It was the norm. Rome expanded, conquered peoples, accumulated riches, and raised enormous monuments. But all of that came with a cost. The bigger the empire, the more room there was for games of influence. And the Senate was the perfect stage for it. But before we understand how these hidden mechanisms worked, we need to understand who actually sat in those seats. Because contrary to what many imagine, the Senate wasn't made up of the best men of Rome. It was made up of the most influential. And influence, back then, could be bought, inherited, earned, or taken by force. A senator's son was practically born with his career ready. Prestige, connections, money, and expectations were already there. His youth was spent in a kind of political training, learning Rome's most valuable art, the game of power. And that game was anything but innocent. Influential senators had their own groups, known as factions. They were like secret clubs that operated quietly inside and outside the marble walls of the Curia. There, they decided who would be supported for office, who would be destroyed by public opinion, and even who might rise to the highest position, that of consul. And everything, absolutely everything, depended on alliances and debts. Yes, debts. Because when one senator helped another climb the ladder, that created an obligation, a guaranteed vote, a convenient silence, support when the moment came. The Senate was a labyrinth of silent agreements that were never written down, yet governed Rome more than any formal law. And there's one more detail that few people remember. Even when the empire emerged and emperors began ruling officially, the Senate didn't lose its influence. In fact, many emperors only reached the throne because certain senators working in the shadows allowed it. And that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next parts. How these secret agreements worked, who were the men pulling the strings behind the scenes, and how this hidden system of power shaped the history of the greatest superpower of the ancient world. Ready to continue this journey through the dark corridors of Rome? To understand how the Senate operated in the shadows, we first need to understand something essential. It didn't need to raise its voice to control Rome. It only needed to choose the right person to whisper in the right ear. While ordinary citizens saw decrees, public decisions, and fiery speeches, the real politics happened far away from the crowd's eyes. And if there was one skill senators mastered like no one else, it was the art of influencing without ever looking like they were influencing. Officially, the Senate was responsible for guiding magistrates, advising generals, managing finances, and overseeing foreign policy. But that was just the surface, the part that appeared in official records. What truly mattered, what actually changed the game, was never written down. Think about it. Rome was enormous. There were provinces, legions, governors, taxes, trade routes. And each of these areas had powerful people involved. People who, in one way or another, depended on the Senate's goodwill. That's where the game begins. When a senator wanted control over a wealthy province, he didn't need to go there himself. He only needed to back the right candidate, someone loyal. And once that governor took office, who do you think he rewarded? With privileged information, with contracts, with gifts, and of course, with favors. Favors were the most valuable currency in Rome. Many imagined that wealth was the foundation of Roman power, and it was, but not in the obvious way. Money wasn't used just to buy land or slaves. It bought people, political support, loyalty, and most importantly, silence. Because yes, there were things that could not be spoken about even inside the Curia. Secrets, strategies, risky deals, dangerous rumors, and everyone knew that the right piece of information, or the wrong one, could turn a senator into a powerful man or destroy him completely. This dynamic created a very particular type of political figure in Rome, the shadow patron. This senator wasn't the most famous nor always the richest, but he was the one with the most allies, the one who could mobilize the most votes, the one with the most friends in strategic positions. He was the true director of the gears, and the most surprising part is that many of these men operated quietly. They didn't need to shine. They only needed to pull the right strings. Rome functioned like a vast web of relationships, almost like an invisible machine, with each thread connected to another. And when one thread was pulled, another trembled. But there was something that made all of this even more dangerous: internal conflicts, because where there is power, there is rivalry, and senators had no limits when they wanted to destroy an opponent. Smear campaigns, betrayals, election manipulation, sabotage, broken alliances. Politics in Rome was a battlefield as deadly as any war. And do you think that was bad? Believe me, we haven't even begun to touch the darkest strategies, the forbidden alliances, and the manipulations that changed the fate of the entire empire. If you think the Roman Senate acted only through eloquent speeches and quiet agreements, it's time to uncover the far more dangerous side of this story. Because when necessary, those men in togas never hesitated to use the oldest tactic in human history: manipulating the population. Yes, the Roman people, so proud of their republic, were often nothing more than pieces on a board. Rome had something unique. Its population was huge, loud, passionate, and easily inflamed. Citizens gathered in plazas, forums, and markets. They shared rumors, celebrated their heroes, and booed their public enemies. And every one of those emotions could be steered as long as someone knew how to do it. And who knew? The senators. They did this through three main weapons: influence, spectacle, and violence. Starting with influence. Senators had clients, ordinary people, who depended on them for work, money, or protection. These clients, in return, did exactly what their patrons demanded: vote for a certain candidate, spread rumors, applaud at the right moment, or create chaos in public assemblies. It was a form of manipulation, as simple as it was effective. Then came the spectacles. Rome was addicted to entertainment: chariot races, gladiator fights, religious festivals, and senators used all of it as political propaganda. Want to promote yourself? Organize a massive spectacle. Want to ruin a rival's reputation? Pay the crowd to boo him. Want popular support? Hand out free food and wine during the games. It was politics blended with theater. But the darkest side of manipulation was violence. Armed street groups weren't rare. Some senators maintained entire private gangsmen paid to intimidate opponents, disrupt elections, and even physically attack rivals. In certain periods, Rome became nearly ungovernable, with street fights sparked by the politicians themselves. The people saw the chaos, but they never noticed who was pulling the strings. And behind all of this was a very clear pattern. The Senate used the people when it needed them, and ignored them when it didn't. When they wanted to pressure a magistrate, they spread rumors. When they wanted to crush an enemy, they sent crowds to protest. When they wanted to justify controversial decisions, they fueled unrest. And yet, to the average citizen, it all looked spontaneous. The Senate watched. The Senate calculated. The Senate acted. The scariest part? This strategy wasn't unusual. It was a natural part of politics. But this was only the beginning. Because as the Republic grew and power became more concentrated, a new element entered the scene. One that would change everything: the generals. Up to this point, we've seen how the Senate manipulated the people, controlled alliances, and moved the gears of power from behind the curtains. But something began slipping out of their hands, something they couldn't control for long: the generals. And here we reach the point that changed Rome's destiny forever. An influential senator could control votes, decisions, and deals, but a general could control legions, and a loyal legion was worth far more than any speech. For a long time, the Senate believed it could handle generals the same way it handled governors and magistrates, choosing them, rewarding them, punishing them, and replacing them whenever convenient. But slowly, those military commanders began to realize something simple, yet revolutionary. They were loved by the troops, the Senate was not. And once the generals understood that, the balance of power began to crack. The Senate tried to maintain control by deciding which generals would take over a province, lead a campaign, or march toward a certain territory. But the generals knew that the farther they were from Rome, the freer they were to act. And the more victories they achieved, the more influence they accumulated, influence the Senate could not contain. Some of them returned to Rome covered in glory. They received triumphs, were treated as heroes, won the love of the people, and most importantly, the absolute respect of their soldiers. And that terrified the senatorial elite. Why? Because suddenly the senators realized they were not dealing with mere ambitious politicians, but with men who commanded entire armies loyal to them. And if a general decided the Senate was no longer useful, nothing could stop him. That's when the clashes began. Heated debates, political accusations, attempts to strip generals of their commands, and of course, silent conspiracies within the walls of the Curia. But all of this only made things worse. The more the Senate tried to limit the generals' power, the more threatened those generals felt. And when a powerful man feels threatened, he doesn't retreat. He arms himself. It was in this growing tension that famous names emerged. Men who started as instruments of the Senate, but soon surpassed the institution itself. Men who made the people wonder whether the Senate was still the heart of Rome, or just the shadow of something much greater. The relationship between the Senate and the military commanders would never be the same again. And every step taken in that direction brought Rome closer to an inevitable abyss. Because when two powers compete, one built on tradition, the other built on swords, one of them will always give in. And I can guarantee you it wasn't the side holding the scrolls. When the Senate realized that the generals were growing too fast, it tried to react. But it was already too late. Rome had become a board where every piece had a will of its own, and any wrong move could topple centuries of tradition. The Senate, once absolute, now had to deal with men whose authority came not from laws, but from the devotion of thousands of armed soldiers. And to try to regain control, the senators turned to what they knew best: secret alliances. Here's how it worked. A group of senators would unite to support one general against another. They promised positions, funding, votes, and influence, all in exchange for one thing: loyalty. But this game had a very serious flaw. The Senate was not a united body. Each senator worked for himself. So while one faction supported a general, another faction supported his rival. Rome became a maze where no one knew who was allied with whom, and where any agreement could collapse with a single whisper. And it was in this toxic atmosphere that some of the most explosive alliances in the history of the Republic emerged. The most famous one, of course, involved three men who would change everything. One brilliant, one influential, and one wealthier than anyone. These secret arrangements created political forces so powerful that the Senate had no escape. It was like facing storms with a lantern in hand. But this didn't happen overnight. The decay was slow, almost invisible. First, the Senate ignored the moments when certain generals used violence to influence decisions. Then it overlooked corruption and intimidation because it was convenient. Next, it tolerated smear campaigns that destroyed reputations to benefit allies. And by the time it finally noticed the size of the problem, the monster was already alive. And guess what? It would devour Rome. The generals realized that senators were not as powerful as they appeared, and they began using that against them. They pushed for greater commands, demanded richer provinces, threatened to withhold taxes, and, when necessary, mobilized their legions for negotiations. The Senate backed down, and every time it backed down, it lost a piece of the authority it claimed to defend. And if, on one hand, senators tried to control generals through agreements, on the other hand, those same generals made deals among themselves. Without the Senate knowing, it was double-dealing in its purest form. The Senate manipulated the generals manipulated the Senate, and everyone tried to manipulate the people. The result? Rome became divided by private interests so powerful that no possible consensus could fix it. The city that prided itself on order had turned into a powder keg ready to explode. And when that explosion finally came, the world witnessed something unprecedented. It was no longer the Senate ruling Rome. but men who seized power by force and who would never fully give it back. In the end, the Roman Senate, that institution which for centuries represented power, tradition, and stability, ended up becoming a victim of the very game it created. For so long, senators manipulated the people, forged secret alliances, controlled elections, and pulled the strings of politics, that they didn't notice the moment those strings began slipping from their hands. Rome had grown too big, the empire had become too vast, and the generals far too powerful. And so the institution that had once guided the Republic found itself surrounded by forces it had helped strengthen. The people now preferred military heroes over men in togas. Generals were seen as saviors, men who brought victories, wealth, and security. Meanwhile, the Senate looked increasingly trapped in its own internal disputes, petty rivalries, and decisions that always came too late. It was inevitable. The Republic didn't fall overnight. It was slowly pushed into a corner until it was finally replaced by something new. Power concentrated in the hands of a single leader. A leader who, for many, represented order in the middle of chaos. A leader who would bring an end to centuries of internal conflict. And when this new government took shape, the Senate realized a bitter truth. They were still there, but they no longer decided anything. They continued to exist, of course. After all, Rome didn't erase its traditions so easily. But the shine was gone. The Senate, once the heart of the Republic, had become nothing more than a shadow of what it once was. And ironically, it all happened because it allowed it. It allowed generals to accumulate power. It allowed secret alliances to replace laws. It allowed corruption, manipulation, and violence to become political tools. The Senate that ruled from the shadows ended up being consumed by those very shadows. Yet, despite this tragic end, one thing remains fascinating. All of this happened not because of great foreign wars, but because of internal conflicts, personal ambitions, and power games that no one could see. But that decided the fate of millions. And that's why studying this chapter of history is so important. Because Rome didn't fall due to a lack of military strength. It fell because of its own leaders. And maybe deep down, that's the greatest warning ancient history can give us. If you enjoyed this journey through the shadows of the Roman Senate, don't leave just yet. There's another incredible video waiting for you on the screen right now. Click on the next video to continue this voyage through history. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new episode. Leave your like, it helps our work more than you can imagine. Comment below what you want to see next about ancient Rome. I read everything. Remember, we are the ones who remember, the ones who question, the ones who refuse to bow to the silence of history. And you, are you ready for the next secret of Rome?